Trouble is that when the Haitian mind expresses itself, it causes consternation. Haitian mind is no different, but it's presented and constructed as different. When the Haitian mind, if we were to generalize in that way, expressed itself in 1804, it caused global consternation. That is, how could slaves create a modern society? Slave revolts are totally comprehensible. And indeed, in the case of Jamaica, for instance, a pact was made with the Maroon community in Jamaica, and they were allowed to exist. And they're there to this very day in Akompong. But Haiti must not exist because Haiti has done the unthinkable. That is, Haitians are attempting to create a modern state. When in 1990, the Haitian mind again expressed itself by voting for President Aristide. I'm not an Aristide defender, but I was there. It's an election I observed for CARICOM, and the Haitian people expressed themselves. It was in the cards that Aristide would not last because, well, as you know, by the next year he was ousted from power because, and then we begin to get the same picture of lawlessness, mysticism, capable of governing themselves, etc. So, point 2, Haitian exceptionalism. Point 3, amnesia. We don't have to repeat the idiocies of Pat Robertson, who thinks that Haiti not only made a pact with the devil, but had to free themselves from Napoleon III. We were told on CBS on Sunday morning that it was the US that removed Jean-Claude Duvalier from power, instead of actually ensuring his safe exit from Haiti when the angry mob had arrived at the palace gates. And in fact, not only ensuring his safe departure, but putting in power a junta made up of Duvalier's army to ensure democratic elections. And not only putting the junta in power, but giving the junta millions of dollars in what was called at the time non-lethal aid. George Schultz called it non-lethal aid, and I remember in 1987 seeing graffiti on the walls of Port-au-Prince, Schultz Makut. The US intervention in 1994 is hardly mentioned, as that intervention to return President Aristide was never meant to seriously restore democracy. Its most immediate cause was to stop the exodus of refugees. And if you know, think of what's happening at the present time, there are US Coast Guard cutters patrolling Haiti to make sure that no boats leave. So the big driving force of US policy in 1994 under Bill Clinton was refugees. I was in Jamaica at the time, and the USS Comfort, which is heading for Haiti, even as we speak, was in the Kingston Harbor and was filled with refugees. Guantanamo was filled with refugees. The Coast Guard cutters were filled with refugees, and there were refugees on the sea. Obviously, the situation could not continue. Therefore, again, negotiation with Cedras, who was the head of the junta at the time, who is now sitting comfortably, I think, in Panama City. He hasn't been asked to return. Everybody's been asked to return, including Duvalier, and Aristide was restored. So, no attempt at serious democratic reform in 1994. In 2004, the US intervenes again, this time to allow the ouster of Aristide. The US ambassador at the time in Haiti, in his farewell address, spoke of the support for those who helped perpetrate the coup, such as the International Republican Institute. And he called them, absolutely wonderful term, the chimère of Washington. the chimere of Washington, who don't have official posts, but make sure that Haiti policy goes in a particular direction. Now that everyone sees the effect of a weak Haitian state, no one remembers Washington's role in weakening such a state in 2004 and pushing Haiti into lawlessness. Because again, even as we speak, no one seems to mention that Guy Philippe and Chamberlain, both of whom led the coup d'etat, well, I assume they're in Haiti, unless the earthquake was really an act of God. Fourth point, baseballs. Right. Lawrence Pezzulo, the US Special Envoy to Haiti in 1994, once said, "We were in Haiti for 19 years, and it still strikes me as strange that it's the only place in the Caribbean that does not play baseball." That's not true. I'm from Trinidad, and we don't play baseball. But he has a point. Here's a point. They don't play baseball. That means they didn't leave baseball with them, but they left something else. Clearly, they left behind factories that could make baseballs. And as you probably know, Haiti was at one point the biggest exporter of baseballs to the US. Because apparently, and I've heard this said, Haitian hands are particularly good at doing the stitching that's needed on a baseball so that the flight is true. The US does not see, frankly, compelling national or security interests at stake in Haiti. It's one of the reasons why Haiti has never priority in US foreign policy. And US intervention in Haiti only comes when the situation is too serious or too disturbing for them to avoid. If Haiti were not off the coast of Florida, the US would not be involved. Important point here is that efforts must be made to keep the 8 or so million Haitians from getting into boats and landing in Florida. Sidney Mintz, mentioned, wrote very interestingly in 1995 on the intervention of the US under Clinton. Let's read a little bit of what he said. "Now we Americans are back, and the situation is as murky as before. That any Haitians at all wanted us in there is a good measure of the desperation that daily and viciously arbitrary thuggery could inspire among poor, decent peoples. But what seems clear is that our estimates of the capacity of the Haitian masses to act, always in a manner we would consider fittingly democratic, means that we choose to ignore Haiti's history and recent suffering." He concludes by saying, "If it is our policy to sustain at all costs the present distribution of economic power in Haiti, hardly anything can be done that could have a long-range beneficial political consequence. In that case, it behooves us to make this clear and to face the international assessment of our policies. What ought not to be permitted is to sustain a constellation of forces that will lead inexorably to renewed terror upon our departure and to call that impartiality." I will end by saying quite simply, as far as I'm concerned, we are now precisely in the morning after 1804. That is a ruined country which has to be rebuilt. And we can only hope that the coming 200 years will be different. Thank you.
Greenberg, Executive Director of the Center on Law and Security at the NYU School of Law. Professor Greenberg is the author of The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days, published in 2009, and editor or co-editor of several other books on torture, Abu Ghraib, and Al-Qaeda. She is the editor of the NYU Review of Law and Security, and a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations.
So I'm the person here who doesn't belong. But, so my job is really just to think about this for you, or help you think about how I think our government is thinking about what's happened in Haiti and what to do. I will tell you that in 1996, I was asked to go to Haiti to assess the possibility of setting up a civil society foundation there, one of these brokered relationships with, I would say, the Haitian elite and the Western world. My recommendation was that there was so much going on in like subterranean politics that we should think about what we were going to do there very carefully. And I did not oversee the effort going forward, but others did. So the role that Haiti has played in my past is just clearly a culture and a country that I felt the United States needed to understand more than I thought the people I was working with at the time understood it before they made any recommendations or made any decisions. The reason I bring that up is that while I'm not a Haitian scholar, my job involves assessing, among other things, what the U.S. does in the name of security around the world. So when I see the response to the devastation in Haiti, it's so interesting how, for those of you who think about Haiti, you think about it in your terms. But actually, the words that we hear in the larger global sphere are the same words we hear when we talk about Afghanistan, to some extent when we talk about Iraq, when we talk about Yemen, when we talk about Somalia. We live in the context of failed states, of failing states, of states that we don't know enough about, in which we, the United States, seems to have had, in many cases, and I'm being careful here, some sort of hand in creating the situation which we are now inheriting. And so the way Haiti fits into a perspective like mine is it's sort of like when you ignore a problem long enough, it will collapse on itself. And I'm not saying that Haiti is not unusual, and I think there are some very distinctive things about what happened in Haiti, particularly that it's a natural disaster as opposed to the political disasters that we have helped, that we've been involved in these other areas. On the other, but it does bring up certain factors, and so I want to just address some of them. And I think it's more important that you hear about Haiti specifically. But one of them, a number of them have been raised, and I want to address this. One is, what about the role of the U.S. military? When you read what's coming out of the U.S. government, you will see numbers. This is the number of Coast Guard cutters. This is the number of military troops. This is the number of dollars that are coming out of whoever budget. And so, is this a militarization? Actually, what's happened over the past 15 years since I've been in Haiti has been that there has been a shift within the U.S. government of monies and programs from the State Department to the Defense Department. And it's something that, we may or may not have noticed on the outside, but we sure are noticing it now. Because in the attempt to rebuild Afghanistan and to address problems around the world, particularly in Africa, we are seeing time and time again a clash between State Department and Pentagon and perhaps other agencies, USAID being right in the middle, objectives. And it's something that, it sounds very bureaucratic. It's actually very substantive and extremely important, and Haiti is going to bring this into great relief, and it already has started to. So this is one area in which I think we have to be very careful. As a subset of that, and let me just say that when you hear people say, when you hear people say, the military has to do this because it's the only expeditionary force we have, that's the word, expeditionary. I wrote a book on the Marines, and it was sympathetic to the Marines. I'm not saying that I don't respect expeditionary forces and what they can do, and what their capacity is. However, You have to think very carefully about saying, well, the State Department isn't resourced, USAID isn't resourced enough, and just say, okay, therefore the Pentagon has to do it. And this is what I mean by problems collapsing upon themselves. People in Washington and people outside Washington who monitor these things have known for a long time that this is a problem and that we need to address this problem, and we haven't. And now Haiti is going to be one more example of a fight we didn't have, a problem we didn't resolve, and how it's going to play itself out. Added to that, you have the issue of, I work at the Center on Law and Security, and the use of the word law and the use of the word security as things that are opposed to one another is going to come up in Haiti, and already has, and it has come up time and time again since 9/11, if not before 9/11, just happens to be my focus, and it's something that we have not addressed sufficiently. We've allowed things to look like they're at odds with one another, in which case they're not. And so when you say, well, we need to secure the place before we can distribute any kind of aid, this is what we have been hearing in Afghanistan. We need to have secure Afghanistan before we can do anything, et cetera, et cetera. So I could go on. There are a lot of things we could talk about, but I think that this is a very pivotal moment, and I don't need to take your focus off of Haiti, for the United States in understanding its own role in the world. And it may not do it the right way. And if it doesn't do it the right way, it will be for the following reason. And this is exactly what we've been seeing for the past decade. That under the rubric of emergency, we do whatever we need to do in a stopgap Band-Aid manner, as if we don't have a policy, as if we don't have a workout, which is actually not the case. As if we say we can't fight this fight now because we have to take care of this. I would venture to say that is exactly wrong. Fight the fight now. We have seen it in one context after another. We have seen it, if you'd like to know, domestically, as well as if Katrina wasn't enough. And so the caveat to that, underneath that, is there are people who are suffering who need help. And so I'm not saying they shouldn't need help. For example, the Comfort. I spent some time on the Comfort. The Comfort is an amazing ship. It should be allowed to do whatever it can do to help people. It has 1,000 beds. It has better hospital service than many of the hospitals in the United States. There are, there's another one, the Mercy. They can deliver what they need to deliver. And there are other things which I don't have to tell you, basically that we're short on troops because we happen to be sending them other places in the world. I don't have to go through all that. I think you know that. But the one thing I want to say, just to close, because I think you've had enough, is that beneath all this policy and all of this rhetoric and all of this political fighting, which has strangled us for so many years now, there is the possibility of compassionate policy. It is not something we've seen in this country. It is not something the United States is good at, I'm sorry to say. And the best example I would take out of the realm of human lives and put, in the idea that when people's mortgages were running out and their neighbors said, and they wanted to take over their home and say, don't help them, don't help them. Like, how does it hurt you if somebody else gets to live in their home and not become a homeless person on the streets who's going to destabilize your society? I hate to put it in selfish terms like that. But what I really want to say is that the idea of compassion is not that you're a more spiritual country or you're a more generous country. The idea of compassion is the only way the world is going to live together in some kind of stability, whether it's an emergency or not an emergency. And so really all I wanted to say to you is that the problem in Haiti is vast and horrific, but it is just one more example of something that we need badly to attend to, and my hope is at this time we will do it with some kind of policy courage.
She is also faculty director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice and co-director of the International Human Rights Clinic. She is co-editor of the book Human Rights Advocacy Stories and author of several articles on human rights and extraordinary rendition. Professor Satterthwaite has worked for a variety of human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights First, and the Haitian Truth and Justice Commission.
I think it's fitting that I'm going right after Karen, Greenberg because I want to talk about kind of how the discourse of human rights can be problematic in this setting. It's kind of the double discourse of human rights. And to put that in context, I just want to briefly note, just explain why we were handing out this book, if some of you saw it, called Washington Soleil, which is a report we did on the right to water in Haiti. This report looks at how, basically what the impact, human rights impact was on Haitians withholding of loans. So if the issue is the development of a functioning state that can fulfill the human rights of Haitians, the question was, how has the international community, and in particular in this instance, the United States government, weakened the capacity of the state to fulfill those rights? So we looked at a particular community in Port-au-Paix, which is in northern Haiti, where there had been loans slated and had actually been approved and had gone through all of the processes from the Inter-American Development Bank to create a new functioning potable water system. And those loans were essentially blocked for political reasons, and in the name, in fact, of human rights. The idea was that there was no democracy in Haiti, and therefore there shouldn't be, the loans should not go through. And essentially what happened was the water system deteriorated over a period of a decade. And what we found through, we tried to do a careful empirical analysis where we actually went and did a household survey, a randomized household survey using GPS. We found that people were basically not accessing any potable water. We did things like testing water sources. With the exception of water that you buy like this, there were no clean water sources in the entire town. Zero, nothing, zero, including the water that people were buying from tankers. And then the second, I think, really important finding to just put things in context is the amount of water that Haitians were using in Port-au-Paix, and that was on average, I have to find the number so I can give you, on average 9.2 liters per day per person, okay? So I want to put that in context for you. That is about a toilet flush. What is the basic minimum, according to the WHO? 20 liters per person per day, and that's just for survival. So I just want to put this all in context. That's before this crisis. And so the point of this report is to say, this is obviously a human rights disaster, and there were very particular political reasons that led to that human rights disaster, that were the politicization of aid and the withholding of loans. So we're not talking about grants, we're talking about loans here. So that's the context in which I'm just going to briefly comment on the current crisis. We also just did a survey over this past summer in the Central Plateau on the right to food. And the idea here is not to just say Haitians don't have enough food, which I think is very obvious, but to say, let's look at the interventions of the international community and see, are they actually advancing the right to food, or are they potentially hindering? And many of you who know about food aid will know that what often happens is that local agricultural systems are displaced by U.S. food aid, which is actually